The shooting of a young father-to-be spreads fear in a Florida town.
He's laying in the yard, there's blood in the back of his head, and he's not moving.
The barrel of the gun was right up against his head.
There was no shell casing, no firearm, there was no tire trap.
The killing leaves behind a trail of devastation and dismantled dreams.
They had a baby on the way. They were making changes. They were going to have a better life.
Detectives face a bounty of potential suspects.
You hear anything throughout the night? No.
It was strange how somebody can be shot in your front yard and you don't hear a gunshot.
Did you hear it?
No.
No?
I've never even owned a gun.
Eventually, the truth reveals a twisted love story driven by desperation.
Sure that you love it?
Yes.
There was an almost obsessional interest. There were thousands of texts.
There was the point where I think she lost her mind.
He was outfitted with a listening device and was sent to the home. Her boyfriend had sent a text message later saying that he was coming for him.
The oldest motive in the world, unrequited love.
November 11th, 2015, Seminole, Florida. Just after 8:15 a.m., a father is driving his kids to school when he spots something odd in a neighbor's yard.
He passed by the residence and saw a body on the ground out front of the house in the yard. He continued to drop his children off and came back.
On his way back, after dropping his children off from school, he stopped and met up with another individual that stopped and kind of investigated what's going on.
The victim was a young male in his early 20s. He was a white male. He had a apparent gunshot wound to the right side of his head.
Once he figured out what he had, he called 911, and that was around 8:30.
911, is this a police, fire, or medical emergency?
Yeah, it looks like somebody's dead outside. He's laying in the yard, there's blood in the back of his head, and he's not moving.
Okay.
When deputies with the Pinellas County Sheriff's Office arrive at the scene, occupants of the home begin to emerge.
You know, someone that lives in the house with them.
The male victim was a young man by the name of Christopher. He was 24 years old.
One of Chris's roommates, Allie Kreider, appears shocked to see her friend's body.
As soon as I saw Chris on the ground, I turned back around and went back inside and went and held my dog. I consider him my brother. He was not my friend, so he was my family.
As friends process the tragic news, detectives arrive and begin to scour the scene for evidence.
When I first arrived on the scene, I approached the body with forensics. As I did, I saw a gunshot wound to the head.
He was laying in the yard with his arm kind of, around his face, and you really had to look a little closely to see the gunshot wound. It was a contact wound, which means that just what it says. The barrel of the gun was right up against his head.
From my experience, those are generally consistent with suicide as opposed to homicide. When you're looking at a suicide investigation, you're looking for the firearm.
Usually with the suicide, the gun is right there, and there was no gun there.
Determined we need to proceed and investigate this as a homicide at that time.
Chris never looked for trouble, so why would trouble come try to find Chris?
Born in 1991, Chris was raised by his mother and grandparents in Pinellas County.
Chris's father wasn't in the picture. Christopher, his mother, and his grandparents lived next door to us. Christian, my husband at the time, and I actually became instant friends with his grandmother. My son Aaron and Chris were inseparable. They were always on their bikes and stuff, riding around the neighborhood. We had a trampoline in our backyard, so the kids were always in our backyard on the trampoline.
I've known him since I was a child. I considered Chris one of my brothers.
When Christopher was a teenager, he and his mother moved away.
At that point in time, his mom remarried and they moved. And that broke his grandmother's heart. Chris's grandmother fought tooth and nail to get him back home. And it worked. He came back home. He came out of his shell as he got older. Never was in trouble. Very, very book smart. Just a great kid all around. Everybody that met him liked him.
Chris was a very caring, down-to-earth, well-mannered young man. He would always help people out.
After his return home to Seminole, Christopher started dating the attractive and bubbly Stephanie Dalrymple during his junior year of high school.
Stephanie is a very genuinely happy, outgoing, loving, caring person. I thought Stephanie was the perfect fit for Chris when I first met her.
Stephanie and Chris were in love. Every time they were together and I saw them, they were happy and good, but who knows what happens behind closed doors.
They were boyfriend and girlfriend for a period of time, and then all I knew is that they broke up. I really don't know all the details about it.
After high school, the couple linked back up in their early 20s and discovered their old flame wasn't completely out.
They started, hanging out more, and they got back together. At one point in time, she was living with him.
Both of Christopher's grandparents had since passed on, and he had been allowed to live in their home.
Christopher lived in this house with several individuals. They also had 11 pit bulls. I believe 5 adults and about 6 puppies were in that house.
By 2015, the cramped living quarters and trials of adulthood proved tough on Stephanie and Christopher's relationship.
They started running into what a lot of people run into in life. They had bills to pay. He was working at a restaurant, cleaning dishes. She was working at a fast food restaurant. They got stressors in their life, and it led to some conflict.
The stress came to a head late one night in August when Stephanie and Christopher had a major blowout. Stephanie called on a new friend to pick her up, 37-year-old Dawn Houck.
Stephanie's manager at the local fast food restaurant, Dawn, came and picked her up from this argument.
It was the person she knew that she could contact, she said, at 3:30 in the morning. Dawn was more than happy at that point to head over to Chris's house.
Stephanie decided to move back home with her mom and dad because they were not getting along as well as they wanted to.
She and Chris continued dating off and on until October of 2015, when Stephanie received life-changing news.
She found out she was pregnant. They were getting back together and working on their relationship because they wanted the best life for their child. Chris's dad wasn't in the picture, and that was something that he was real big on.
He was so excited. As soon as Chris found out he was having a baby, he was going to be all about the baby no matter what.
But a few weeks later, 24-year-old Christopher's dream of fatherhood comes to an end on his own front lawn.
My ex-husband, Christian, and my daughter Allie and my son Aaron were living at Christopher's at the time. Christian called me, and I was pretty much in shock. I didn't want to believe that happened. Who would have done this?
We did not have a lot of physical evidence on the scene, and we were trying to use anything we could to point towards a potential suspect.
Coming up, detectives find their first possible lead at the crime scene.
He was a convicted felon. He had a reputation of having firearms.
And a hitch in Chris's love life raises flags.
Stephanie had developed a romantic relationship with a woman.
November 11th, 2015. Detectives with the Pinellas County Sheriff's Office are standing over the body of 24-year-old Chris Rotenberger, the victim of a close-range gunshot wound.
There was no shell casing that was immediately located. There was no firearm. There was no tire track. They really didn't come up with anything.
I saw nothing from my training experience that led me to believe that there was a struggle or any kind of fight.
But when investigators recover a small baggie of marijuana in Chris's pocket, a potential motive surfaces.
It gets some people to maybe speculate that there was some kind of narcotics-related explanation for what happened.
Investigators are anxious to question all 4 of Chris's roommates.
We started bringing all the roommates to the station so they could be interviewed individually. Christian Kreider, his son Aaron Thompson, was a roommate of Christopher's. Aaron's sister Allie was also a roommate with her boyfriend Jordan. They all lived in the home.
Before questioning begins, authorities run the roommates' names in the system and find one of the 4 more suspicious than the others.
Christian Kreider was the father of Aaron and Allie, who both lived with Chris. He had moved into the house and was sharing a room with Aaron at the time of the murder.
He had a criminal record, had some firearms charged.
He was a convicted felon, and he was somebody we need to take a closer look at.
Detectives ask Christian about what happened the night before the murder.
So you go to sleep about 11:30, 11:45? Yes. What happens next? You hear anything throughout the night?
I hear the dogs, normal thing, a few times a night they'll bark. I remember hearing them bark this morning. I just yelled out to them, "Shut up!" And then they quit barking.
He had claimed he had not heard anything, which I thought was strange, how somebody could be shot in your front yard and you don't hear a gunshot.
Detectives also sit down with Christian's daughter, Allie. She says Chris came home from work around 3 a.m.
Chris worked at the restaurant on the night shift, so when he got home late, my kid's father, Jordan, went to go talk to him. And they talked for about maybe 10 minutes, and Chris went back outside.
Allie tells detectives Chris had adhered to his nightly post-shift routine.
He'd come home after work and then sit outside, do his little dip shit.
So he'd sit on the porch and dip after he got home?
And before he'd work. Because he didn't smoke cigarettes. Everybody else in the house smoked cigarettes.
Allie says that while Chris was outside, the house grew quiet and she went to sleep, albeit briefly.
You heard a bang?
Yep.
Remember what time that was?
Jordan said it was around 3:30 or something like that.
What do you think the loud bang was?
I thought it was the dogs trying to get through the window.
The dogs had already tried to jump through it, and it was cracked and covered with a cardboard box cut out. I did not check, and we went back to bed.
She went back to sleep and was asleep until her father woke her up the next morning saying that Christopher was in the front yard.
According to Allie, Christopher didn't have enemies. In fact, he was on the brink of a new chapter in life, fatherhood.
I said although Stephanie had just moved out, she had found out she was pregnant, so they were going to try to work on things for the baby.
In separate interview rooms, investigators press the other 2 roommates, Aaron Thompson and Jordan Beck, for information.
Do you have any problem with anybody?
No, not that I know of. I mean, not to that, like that nature.
Did you shoot him?
No.
No?
I've never even owned a gun.
Okay. If you were us, who would you be suspicious of? Would any...
To hold them, investigators wrap up the interviews with the roommates, but make a request before sending them on their way.
The police asked all of us to take a gunshot residue test. The police asked all of us for all of our phones. And the police also asked all of us to take a lie detector test.
We conducted voice stress analysis tests on them, determined if they were being truthful.
With the tests underway, detectives receive word that a dramatic scene is unfolding back at Chris's house.
A young woman showed up on scene in a panic. She was very upset, frantic, and we learned that it was Christopher's girlfriend, Stephanie.
She was notified by one of Chris's roommates.
Stephanie arrives, and when she sees the body in the yard, she becomes extremely distressed.
Stephanie was pregnant, she was in a panic, and was ultimately transported to the hospital by paramedics to ensure her safety.
Detectives aren't able to talk with Stephanie, but find her mother, Kathy, at the scene. And Kathy is eager to point detectives in the direction of a potential suspect.
Stephanie's mother, Kathy, told me on scene that Stephanie had developed a friendship with a female manager at the McDonald's where she worked, and that the manager had become possessive of Stephanie.
Stephanie's mother had mentioned the name of Don Houck as the manager of where Stephanie worked.
Though Dawn and Stephanie's friendship began at work in the summer of 2015, it soon expanded beyond their time on the clock.
She and Dawn were spending a lot of time together. They would talk and text several times a day.
Stephanie had confided in Dawn. Dawn was also 14 years her senior and experienced more relationships at that point.
Dawn has unfortunately had terrible luck when it came to romance and being in love. She is a very sweet woman. A lot of the women she dated would claim that she was getting a little clingy.
Me and Dawn dated for 5 years before we decided to get married. About 2010, I just drifted away. I found somebody that would give me what I was looking for at the time.
Though Dawn's loyalty to her partners was sometimes perceived as overbearing, she offered the same dedication to her friends.
She's the kind of person that would give her shirt off her back if he needed it.
She was a good person. Someone who was there for you when you needed her.
I looked up to Dawn. She treated my mom good. She treated me good. She was an excellent person.
Protective of anyone that she was close with. She was the kind of person that would put herself in front of harm to prevent harm from happening to other people.
As detectives interview Stephanie's mother at the crime scene, they learn that Dawn had recently become more than just a good friend to her daughter.
Dawn and Stephanie, they began as friends, and then it became more than friends. They became intimate.
We determined that the manager was somebody we needed to speak with.
As investigators add Dawn's name to their list of leads, they receive word that the test results are back on Christopher's roommates.
We used the gunshot residue to rule in and rule out potential suspects. None of the roommates had gunshot residue located on their persons.
The voice stress test results are a different story.
We all did comply with the police with the lie detector test and the gunshot residue test, but from what I believe, they found my father, Christian, deceitful from the lie detector test.
Coming up, detectives put their first lead to the test.
We spoke with a lot of his associates. We tried to determine if anybody had seen him with a firearm in recent months.
And mysterious threats paint an ominous picture for investigators.
This number texted me saying, look here, you stupid prat. You need to leave Chris alone.
In the hours after 24-year-old father-to-be Chris Rotenberger is found murdered, detectives have been grilling his roommates for information. When one roommate, Christian Kreider, fails a voice stress test, investigators immediately put deputies on the lead.
We spoke with a lot of his associates. We tried to determine if anybody had seen him with a firearm in recent months. Some of his friends who he had hunted with in the past said when they would go hunting, Christian would stay back at camp because he was not legally allowed to own a firearm.
I told him, I said, you guys are looking in the wrong direction. I mean, my ex-husband might be a lot of things, but that's one thing he's not. He's not a murderer or killer. Especially when it came to Chris. He was another son to us.
My father was compliant with the police, and even though the lie detector test thought he was deceitful, he came out to be cleared of a suspect.
Ultimately, we located no evidence.
With Christian fading from focus, detectives turned to Chris's girlfriend, 23-year-old Stephanie Dalrymple, who has now been cleared by doctors for questioning.
She was very distraught about Christopher's death. She was very upset and seemed genuinely concerned about what had occurred.
She described her actions that night, in picking Chris up from work, going to a party, verified that she went through the drive-thru restaurant at McDonald's and dropped Chris off. She then went home to her mom's house, so her alibi seemed pretty tight.
Though Stephanie isn't aware of any enemies Chris might have, she does tell detectives about a saboteur targeting their relationship.
It was right after I found out I was pregnant. This number texted me saying, look here, you stupid fat you need to leave Chris alone, he's mine now. My first reply was, I'm pregnant with this. They said, you're just trying to trap him, yada yada yada.
How long did this go on for?
Maybe an hour, and then I called my mom and had her block the number.
The text messages indicated that Christopher Rodenberger had a relationship with another woman.
Alright, well, did you ask him, have you been with somebody?
He said no. But I don't know if he was lying or not.
Did you believe him?
I gave him a benefit of the doubt.
Investigators ask Stephanie about the fling she had with her manager, Don Houck, before she got back together with Chris.
We only talked for like a few months.
Were you guys having a relationship?
Intimate? Yes. Like a actual relationship?
Some people can't draw that line, right?
Some people can't.
Could she draw the line?
I want to say yes, but sometimes no, because she would always be so close to me, like it was suffocating.
She kind of felt like the manager got a little too close and was a little too into her, and had kind of broken off the relationship. She ever tell you she loved you?
Yes.
Was she jealous of Chris?
I'm not sure. I know she didn't like him at all.
Did she ever threaten Chris?
She sent him a message on his Facebook.
What did the message say?
Basically to leave me or leave her alone.
Before leaving the sheriff's department, Stephanie consents to a phone dump, and detectives double down on their efforts to...
She downplayed her relationship with Stephanie and said that Stephanie was just a friend, and that she knew that Stephanie would ultimately wind up back with Christopher, so she didn't get too attached to her.
Stephanie had been describing the almost obsessional interest that Dawn had in her. She was, saying it really wasn't that big of a thing.
Dawn breaks down her alibi for the previous night into a play-by-play for detectives.
Earlier the day of the murder, she had been watching movies. She later said that after watching the movies, she went out and drove around by herself, the opposite direction of the victim's house, and went home. You said you went from your house and you drove northbound on 34th Street, right? Okay. And then you went south on Park Street and east on Tyrone to 38th Avenue. And then over to BP. Did you go anywhere else that night?
No.
Okay. I may have asked you this before. You don't own any firearms?
No.
And when's the last time you shot a gun?
I was like 11, 12.
Dawn comes across having little to hide. She allows investigators access to her cell phone.
Dawn did give her phone over to the authorities to basically download, dump, analyze, and look at that information.
While Dawn's phone is being processed, investigators return to the only other clue found at the crime scene: a small bag of marijuana recovered from Chris's pocket.
Anytime you have an individual that is involved in some kind of drugs, you also want to look at, was it his? Was he supposed to sell it? Did he not pay his dealer? Those are all avenues, again, that the investigators have to look at.
Detectives explore the drug angle at the restaurant where Chris worked.
Christopher's friends knew about his drug use, knew that he was a regular marijuana smoker.
There was some evidence of some drug use, but it didn't look like the cartel was running some kind of drug operation from that house.
We spoke to co-workers of Christopher's, one of which had been with him shortly before his murder. He advised he'd given Christopher marijuana that night. The marijuana provided to Christopher by this co-worker was located in his pocket following his murder.
Chris's co-workers tell investigators that during a break in his relationship with Stephanie, Chris had a run-in with another co-worker's boyfriend.
Chris made a pass at this person's girlfriend, and her boyfriend sent Chris a text, basically, that he had found out about it.
Her boyfriend had, since Christopher lived in South Carolina, at that time I contacted authorities in South Carolina and asked them to speak with the co-worker's boyfriend.
While investigators wait to hear back from law enforcement in South Carolina, they follow another potential lead.
The anonymous number that was texting Stephanie could be a potential suspect. The sender of the messages is trying to break up Stephanie and Christopher, and apparently wanted Christopher out of Stephanie's life, so that was something we had to look into.
It's the type of phone that law enforcement described as a burner phone, a phone that you don't have a contract with.
People buy and use burner phones to keep authorities from tracking it back to them, to keep the phone from being tied to them, and it gives them a way to be anonymous and not be located.
As that lead dries up, so does the lead involving Christopher's co-worker.
Through the help of authorities in South Carolina, we were able to alibi the co-worker's boyfriend, and he had been in the Carolinas at the time of the murder.
With nothing else to go on, investigators begin the painstaking process of going through the phone dumps from Stephanie and Dawn.
There was a tremendous amount of text activity from Dawn directed to Stephanie, like over 1,000. On September 10th, Dawn texted Stephanie that my feelings for you are pretty overwhelming sometimes. There are times I really can't get you off my mind. I just don't ever want to lose you.
It appeared that Stephanie was trying to just be more of a friend and not so much a romantic interest in Dawn's. It showed that Dawn seemed to be obsessed with Stephanie.
Coming up, Dawn's phone provides even more damning evidence.
Have you inquired about purchasing any firearm?
Not really.
When I saw the gun searches, it began to dawn on me that she'd been untruthful.
And later, a turning point crystallizes.
She gave me for 200. I went and called my cousin, gave him the money. I got the house.
After meticulously combing through thousands of texts between Dawn Houck and Stephanie Dalrymple, investigators uncover telling evidence.
There was direct demonstrable evidence that there was an almost obsessional interest of Dawn into Stephanie.
On August 19th, 2000, indicating that she had purchased a cruise for Stephanie.
She had planned for her and Stephanie to share a cabin, and this cruise was scheduled for somewhere in the area of November 8th.
But just over a week before they were supposed to leave, Stephanie broke life-changing news.
October 29th, Stephanie texted Dawn, said, "So I have to tell you something, but I know you're going to hate me after I tell you, but I have to tell you." Dawn says, "What's up?" Stephanie says, "I'm pregnant." And Dawn says, "That hurts a lot."
Stephanie tells Dawn that she can no longer go on the cruise due to the pregnancy.
Dawn's heartbreak doesn't make her a killer, but what detectives find next might.
When conducting this review of Dawn's phone, I found that she had searched internet ads for approximately 10 hours on November 6, 2015, for firearms purchases. She had also searched how to buy a gun without a background check and cheap guns for sale. When I saw the gun searches on Dawn's phone, it began to dawn on me that she'd been untruthful.
Everything started pointing toward Dawn as a possible suspect in this homicide.
About a month into the investigation, December 11th, we brought Dawn back into the station. She conducted a voice stress analysis, which was inconclusive.
Dawn continues to insist her relationship with Stephanie was casual and offers an explanation for the gun search.
Have you inquired about purchasing any firearms?
Not really. I was thinking about maybe getting my uncle or something for his birthday.
When was his birthday, you know?
Summertime.
If your uncle's birthday's in the summer, why would you search in November? You don't know? Alright.
Investigators find the story fishy, but are unable to prove she is lying.
There was nothing at that point to provide probable cause for an arrest, to point to anything more than her being a person of interest.
Detectives send Dawn home, but continue to investigate her.
At that point, we began to dig into her financials to see if there was anything in those records to indicate that she had purchased a firearm to carry out this crime.
In February 2016, 3 months after Chris's murder, investigators finally get a break.
We subpoenaed Dawn's bank records. When we received the records, we learned that on November 9th, 2015, 2 days before the murder, Dawn had rented gloves and a black hoodie from a local retail store. It's suspicious.
She had no reason to get a rental car, considering how there was nothing wrong, with her vehicle. She bought all things that she could use to stalk him.
While the purchases are suspicious, investigators still need more for an arrest warrant.
As the investigation went on, and subpoenas and court orders, got in various phone records, credit card records, debit card records. They found out that Dawn had bought what we call a burner phone from a local Walmart. They were able to find the receipt and trace the number back to those derogatory texts.
Dawn finds out that Stephanie's pregnant with Chris's child. And the next day, this burner phone's purchased by Dawn, and these text messages start going out. Dawn pretended to be Chris's other woman, stating that Chris really doesn't love you.
The burner phone is Dawn's first attempt, in my opinion, to get Christopher and Stephanie broke up and allow her to insert herself back into Stephanie's life.
Investigators suspect that when Stephanie didn't take the text seriously, Dawn started looking for another way to get Chris out of the picture.
Dawn started doing the search of how to buy a gun without a background check. This is where she definitely decided that this may be the road that she's going to go down, and the only way that she's going to get Stephanie as her own.
During the months following the murder, I was working on the theory that Dawn had committed the murder and that she had purchased the firearm off the street somewhere or via an internet ad.
Despite having strong circumstantial evidence, investigators need to prove that Dawn purchased a gun in order to make an arrest.
We worked feverishly to try to figure out if that had occurred. We subpoenaed gun records. It all kind of came to a dead end. We were unable to put a firearm in her hand.
Investigators begin scouring all contacts in Dawn's phone data, focusing on the days leading up to the crime. In February 2017, they zero in on some vague texts exchanged between Dawn and a coworker, Latique Samuels, 2 days before the murder.
The conversation with Latique that we were able to recover showed that Dawn was going to make a stop on the way to pick him up. However, the contents of what she was stopping for was undetermined at that point.
When investigators compare Dawn's phone records to her ATM transactions, they see
communicated with Latique on November 9th, shortly before she made a $200 cash withdrawal from the ATM machine.
On March 1st, 2017, investigators bring Latik in for an interview.
Latik tells detectives at that time that Don had approached him about buying a firearm.
I was washing dishes and she was like, I got a question. I was like, what's up? She's like, do you know anybody that's selling a gun? I was like, nah, I don't do all that. She's like, oh, all right. And I was like, what you need a gun for? She was like, it's just protection.
Although initially reluctant, a couple of weeks later on November 9th, Latik managed to come through for his friend.
He eventually relayed to the police that he had obtained a revolver on the street.
According to this, it says November 9th, 2015. So that's when she purchased it from you, right?
He said that he ultimately obtained a firearm and sold it to her for $200 in cash.
She gave me the $200, gave her the gun. I went, called my cousin, gave him the money, and I went back in the house.
The $200 that Don withdrew from the ATM was used to purchase the gun. He described it as crisp $20 bills, something you'd potentially get out of an ATM machine.
Knowing that Latik might be the key to a conviction, investigators ask for his help in solidifying the case against Don.
Latik was outfitted with a listening device and was sent to the home to make contact with Don under our supervision.
He had an interaction and a discussion with Don, and Don kind of admitted in that conversation, purchasing the gun from Latik.
All my fingerprints and everything. All my
It's cool. She said that she had gotten rid of the gun and not to worry about his DNA being on it. In my mind, that proves that she used the gun given to her by Latik to commit the murder. In no other context does it make sense.
Coming up, the case against Don proves anything but airtight.
They had no DNA. They had no hair. They had no fiber. They had no eyewitnesses.
It was physically impossible for her to walk up to him, hold the gun up to his head, and fire it in a downward angle. Almost
A year and a half after the murder of 24-year-old Chris Rotenberger, investigators are finally equipped with sufficient evidence to press charges against his suspected killer. On March 2nd, 2017, they place 38-year-old Dawn Houck under arrest.
I arrested Dawn on the front porch of her home. She was under the assumption that I was coming back to bring her phone back to her. She was placed under arrest at that time.
When Dawn's trial begins in December 2018, the state presents its case.
It was the purchase of the gloves. It was the purchase of the hoodie. It was the rental of the vehicle. Purchase of the gun. It was the burner phone. These all come together as what we call circumstantial evidence.
With the amount of circumstantial evidence we had, it only pointed to Dawn Houck. It didn't point to anybody else.
Prosecutors also argue that no one except Dawn Houck had a motive to kill Chris.
Everything's kind of unraveling for Dawn. Stephanie's pregnant with Chris's baby. That was the turning point. I think that was the point where she determined, I may lose her. I think she lost her mind.
Around 3:30 a.m. on November 11th, 2015, prosecutors allege Dawn drove a rental car to Chris's home with the sole purpose of murdering her romantic rival.
The best information we have was that he was sitting out on a chair. She came alongside of him and shot him.
Dawn's attorneys seize on the circumstantial nature of the prosecution's case.
They didn't find the murder weapon. They had no DNA. They had no hair. They had no fiber. They had no audio, they had no video, they had no tire tracks, they had no eyewitnesses. That was the crux of Dawn's defense.
During their investigation, law enforcement found out that Dawn had purchased, with her debit card, binoculars, like a box of plastic globes, and a hoodie. There was no evidence that the individual who committed this crime wore a hoodie, needed binoculars, or wore gloves.
They also argue that if Christopher was standing, not sitting at the time of the murder, it would have been difficult for Dawn to commit the
For her to walk up to him, hold the gun up to his head, and fire it in a downward angle, as indicated by the medical examiner.
2 weeks into the trial, on December 14th, both sides rest. Hours later, the jury announces their decision.
The jury deliberated and, convicted her of first-degree premeditated murder as charged. And she was sentenced to life in prison.
When Dawn's verdict came back guilty and she was sentenced with first-degree murder, I was filled with relief and happiness that she's finally getting what she deserves.
Don Houck murdered Chris Rotenberger for the oldest motive in the world. It was unrequited love.
Murdering Chris was nothing but senseless. She thought she was losing her world, and in reality, she was just losing a person, and she could really move on.
This just blows me away that she could plot something like this and do it. She could have walked away. She had options. This wasn't one of the options she had.
The crime left Christopher's loved ones with a lifetime of heartache, especially his daughter, born 8 months after his murder.
She looks just like him. She does. She acts like him too. So when you look in her eyes, you see Christopher and how he was robbed of being in his daughter's life and how she was robbed not having a father.
She will be 5 this year. Stephanie has a new baby now as well. She and her boyfriend are living together somewhere with their kids. And they're doing really well. And I think Chris is looking down and is happy for her.